Welcome to The Deepening, a podcast that explores the inner journey and its relationship to our outer life through the lens of Jungian psychology, spirituality, and personal transformation. I'm your host, Suzanne Larue. Let's journey inward together. In this episode, I speak with Lisa Marchiano. Lisa is a Jungian analyst, author, and podcaster. She's written several books, including The Vital Spark, Reclaim Your Outlaw Energies and Find Your Feminine Fire, and Dreamwise, Unlocking the Meaning of Your Dreams, which she co-authored with Deborah, Stewart, and Joseph Lee, her co-hosts from the popular depth psychology podcast, This Jungian Life. Lisa is on the faculty of the Jung Institute of Philadelphia, and she lectures and teaches widely. Lisa, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. You're involved in so much, but today I'd love to focus on your recent book, The Vital Spark, Reclaim Your Outlaw Energies and Find Your Feminine Fire. It's such a rich and vital resource for women, and it resonated deeply with me on a personal level, so I'm excited to dig in. Early in The Vital Spark, you lay out two key premises. First, the idea of the unlived life, rooted in Jungian thought, that we often end up living only part of who we are. And more centrally, you explore how this fragmentation tends to play out in gendered ways, and how women often lose access to a specific set of qualities that are essential to our vitality and wholeness. Can you speak to this and elaborate on the kinds of qualities women most often become cut off from?
Yeah, well, I think, that certainly is a good summary of the big ideas in the book. And it relates to what Jung termed the shadow, which I didn't belabor in the book, but essentially this book is about women's shadow and kind of reconnecting with shadow characteristics. And as you said, we tend in the process of development and acculturation to lose access to certain things because they're not valued by our caregivers, by our culture. I mean, essentially, we arrive in the world with a kind of potential wholeness. We have access to everything, but there is a necessary kind of compromise with the demands of the culture, our parents, our caregivers, that we focus on certain attributes and maybe disconnect from others or don't develop those or kind of shove those aside so that we can meet the sort of normal demands. It's not necessarily a bad thing. We have to learn how to get along in society. But it does mean that we can lose access to parts of our personality that might have a lot of life in them. They might be very life-giving and important to our own sense of wholeness. So you said what parts? Well, when I was writing the book, I somewhat arbitrarily came up with a list of 8 qualities. And I wouldn't say that this is any kind of list that has a particular authority to it. I think that these were 8 qualities maybe that I've struggled with and that I've seen my clients struggle with as well. But maybe there are others that I didn't include, but the ones that I did include in the book are disagreeableness, shrewdness, trickster energy, desire, sexuality, rage, authority, and ruthlessness. So my thesis essentially is that these are aspects that most women don't get encouraged to develop. In fact, we may get encouraged to disconnect from them. And that when we can connect with them later in life, they can bring back a lot of vitality, a lot of feeling of integrity and authenticity. And so it's worth it to do that work.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you talk about these qualities that we tend to be conditioned to develop as ones that help us get and stay connected to others. Whereas these qualities that we tend to kind of need to cultivate and integrate are ones that help us get and stay connected to ourselves. You spoke to it a little bit already, but what's at stake if we don't reclaim these parts of ourselves? And what begins to shift when we do?
I think one of the things that can happen if we don't do this work of reclaiming these qualities is that life can start to feel kind of stale and empty and monochromatic and maybe even meaningless. So, a lot of times, what brings someone into analysis is a sense of malaise. Maybe something's really wrong, like a marriage or the career is going haywire. But a lot of times, it's just a feeling like, is this all there is? And oftentimes, the answer to that is not a straightforward kind of exploration. We have to walk all around and circumambulate life events and look at what happened in the past and consider what's happening in the present. But it often does lead us to explore what parts of yourself are you not attending to? Those parts, when they're ignored for long enough, they have a tendency to kind of exert pressure on us from within. And that pressure can feel like unhappiness or malaise. So I think that that's what we stand to gain is a renewed sense of aliveness, maybe even a renewed sense of purpose.
I love that because I think a lot of times people think that it's going to be something really dramatic that brings them into this type of inner work. But oftentimes it is just this kind of sense of feeling disconnected and feeling stuck and not really knowing why. And that feeling of aliveness that you mentioned is actually what's really missing. So I'm curious, of all the outlaw energies you outline in the book, is there one that you personally have found has been most difficult to embody or that was especially challenging to write about?
So I would say that there were some surprises as I wrote. I think the chapter on shrewdness surprised me because really what I'm talking about in that chapter is that women need to give up our innocence complex. We need to stop sort of expecting, for example, that other people are going to take care of us and meet our needs, and get kind of realistic about the fact that sometimes we might just have to armor up and do that for ourselves, for example. And I didn't know that I had so much to say on that topic. So that I think that chapter is the longest one in the book. And I just kind of kept on saying, "Oh wait, there's this and then there's this and then there's this." And every time I sat down, I had some more to say about that. And that was surprising to me when I wrote that chapter. I would say also that I loved writing the chapter on sexuality. That was a really meaningful one for me, and I love the fairy tale that I use in that chapter. But probably the ones that are most difficult, well, one of them would be rage. And it's not surprising. My first book was called Motherhood: Facing and Finding Yourself. And obviously it's about motherhood. But it's interesting because there is a chapter in Motherhood on rage, and there's also a chapter on authority. So it's super interesting to me that there's a chapter in this book about rage and a chapter about authority. So that tells me that those are two of my preoccupations, as it were. I think anger is very, very hard for lots of women. It is certainly hard for me. I find it very uncomfortable to feel angry at someone that especially someone that I care about, and it is almost intolerable for me to know that someone that I care about is angry with me. Now I've gotten better at it, but I think I'm still a work in progress.
Rage is something I also really encountered in my own experience of motherhood. It's something that was intergenerational that came through me. And it was kind of one of those things where it was like I promised myself I would never express my anger the way my mother did, that it wasn't something I was going to allow to come
Mhm.
out. But of course, as you know, when you do that, when you try to repress those energies instead of channeling them thoughtfully, they wind up coming out anyway.
Oh, yes.
And I definitely found that motherhood really helped put me up against that aspect of my shadow in a way that's been painful, but also really helpful.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, motherhood is a great, opportunity to meet, the best in yourself, but also the worst in yourself. One of my favorite quotes, which kind of sums up a big part of motherhood for me, is, the novelist Faye Weldon said, "The best part about not having kids is that you can go on believing that you're a good person."
Hmm. Wow. Yeah, that definitely resonates. Well, I also really loved the chapter on shrewdness. And you define shrewdness as the ability to know what you know. And
Mhm.
that feels so powerful because so many of us, I think especially often women, struggle with self-doubt, indecision, and second guessing. And so I'd love to talk a little more about why shrewdness is such a crucial part of feminine wholeness.
Mhm. I read somewhere recently that there's some research on this. Now, I haven't tracked this research down, but the research says that women are, on average, kind of on a population level, are more likely to avoid telling someone an uncomfortable truth and will instead kind of go along with a white lie to kind of prevent someone from feeling uncomfortable. And I think that goes to what you're talking about, the sort of self-doubt and just giving yourself permission to know what you know. Sometimes we don't allow ourselves to know what we know because it's gonna make someone else uncomfortable. And so we can kind of convince ourselves that everything is okay, for example. It's really a remarkable talent that many people have, but especially women, instead of just pointing out a truth. And I think that this hurts us on an individual level because we will deny a reality of our own about maybe how we've been hurt or made uncomfortable or made to not feel safe in a situation. And it can also hurt us at a kind of population level. I mean, I talk a lot in the book and other chapters about how, women are taught, we're taught to be nice. We teach our girls to be nice. I really I think kindness is an incredibly important value, but I'm also just sick to death of these exhortations for women to be kind, because I think in a way that is really just telling women to not know what you know.
Yeah, you say in the book that this pressure towards kindness defangs us.
Yeah. It certainly can.
For me, when I thought about shrewdness and reading the book, I thought a lot about the ways in which throughout my life I've discounted my own intuition, a
Mhm.
sense that something was going on that I couldn't really put factual evidence to, and so I could therefore kind of talk myself out of.
Yeah, and there's an example of that from my own life that I talk about in Motherhood, where we moved houses when my son was very, very young, and I had it was really an intuition that the house wasn't safe, and I wanted to get it tested for lead, but money was tight, and my husband was like, "No, don't worry about it," and I kept on having this intuition that there's something really wrong, but I just let myself be talked out of it, and then it turned out that there were really, really high lead levels in the house, and my son had lead
Hmm.
poisoning.
A mother's intuition about what we're seeing, even if it's
Mhm,
very, very subtle,
mhm.
can be so powerful.
Yeah,
Yeah, I've had experiences like that.
yep.
No, I work primarily with women in midlife, and I see again and again how some of the qualities you outline in the book, like the fear of being selfish, ruthless, or disagreeable, keeps them from fully pursuing their desires. And you talk about these so-called negative traits as being like arrows in a quiver that
Mhm.
we can call upon and that are necessary for living authentically. How do we reclaim these without swinging too far in the other direction?
Well, it's hard to do it perfectly, and so it's good to let go of the expectation right away that you're going to do it perfectly. Are you gonna get it exactly perfect? No. I do think about these qualities as kind of tools, if you will. And somewhere in the book, I say something like, we all come to adulthood with a kind of behavioral repertoire. So this is what we do when we get angry. This is what we do when we get scared. This is what we do when we get bored. And it's most of us have a pretty narrow repertoire. And I think that in some sense, if you think about Jung's term of individuation, which is really coming into wholeness, part of what that means is that you have a broader repertoire and you can choose let's think about it like arrows in a quiver or maybe tools in a toolbox. You can make a choice consciously. You can make a choice choicefully about what are you going to do now? What are you going to do here? Let's say that you have a conflict with your boss. And so your different tools might be to kind of be very, very compliant and be the kind of employee who always says yes. That's one way of dealing with a situation like that. Another way might be to use some trickster energy. And let's say that you find out that your boss is really into antique cars. So you go off and learn a lot about antique cars and find a way to engage your boss in those conversations so that you kind of get a little bit of a leg up. Another way might be to, use your authority or even your ruthlessness to really set a firm boundary and tell your boss, this is not this, I won't stand for this kind of treatment. Any of those might be right at different times. Some of them will be absolutely wrong at certain times and will get you into a bad situation. It's not say that ruthlessness is better than being agreeable. It's just that it's not the thing that we most of us have cultivated or learned how to be. Most of us have a pretty easy time being agreeable. Speaking kind of on a population level, most women tend to be agreeable. So that's going to come fairly easily for us. And a lot of times that will be the right thing. I mean, if you're an agreeable employee, that often is going to get you pretty far. But the day may come when what you need to do is set a really firm boundary. And then can you do it? Can you access that tool? I mean, I think some of the ways the book has been misunderstood is that I'm sort of wantonly encouraging women to just basically be bitches, No, that's really not it. I think one of the words that gets used and reused in the book a lot is discernment. That's the process of becoming conscious of what is the right thing to do here. Because every situation may require a very individualized response. But my hope is that we can develop a broader range of tools and then develop the discernment and consciousness to make the right choice. This allows us to be more effective in the world, to live out more of our potential, and to be just sort of generally better mates, parents, friends, because we're both authentic. We're able to protect ourselves and to protect our interests and to protect those we love. And we're safe to be around because we can stand up for ourselves. You don't have to worry about running over us. We're going to take care of ourselves. But we're also not going to use any of our power in a hurtful way. We're going to use it when it's necessary, when it's called for.
I really appreciate that emphasis you put on discernment and conscious awareness. And that it's not just for those qualities we're cultivating anew, but also for those qualities that maybe we've always used, like kindness, but being aware when we're using kindness instead of doing it sort of, automatically.
Right.
That we can even choose that more consciously. I'm using kindness here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And the thing you said about maybe encouraging women to be bitchy, that comes up sometimes when I'm doing shadow work. People will say, well, are you saying that I should be selfish?
Mm-hmm.
But the point is that when you become aware, then the quality merges with the persona. The persona and shadow sort of influence one another.
Mm-hmm.
And then we become more balanced.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I feel like we'd be more likely to be bitchy if we're repressing and always trying to be nice all the time.
Right. Because then it kind of comes out sideways.
Then it comes out in a passive-aggressive way.
Yeah, one of the things that, I used to marvel at, and I still do somewhat, is, men can have this like straightforward, healthy entitlement to assert themselves. And it doesn't come across as tense or peaked or anything like that. I was actually at dinner with some friends a month or two ago, and it was a pretty big group of us. And I was kind of sitting at one end of the table with a female friend and a male friend, and we all ordered something. The woman and the man both ordered the same thing, and they both started eating it, and they were like, "Oh, this is really not very good." The woman kind of suffered through it. She ate a little bit of it. The man called the waiter over, the server over, and said, this is really, this is too salty, or forget what the issue was, but and the waiter took it off. And it's not that I think that it was inappropriate for him to do that at all. It's just not what most women would immediately feel comfortable doing. Just this very kind of like straightforward. He wasn't nasty. He wasn't demanding. He didn't make a scene. But, it's like, I don't think I've ever sent anything back in a restaurant ever. I don't think I ever have.
Well, that is me. I will let people know if I'm not happy with what I have, whether it's a hotel room or a table in a restaurant or something I've ordered.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll do it kindly and I'll do it respectfully, but I'd like to have what I'd like to have.
Mm-hmm.
But that is something that throughout my life I've often felt shame around.
Yeah.
And I often felt that people saw me as being too assertive and too direct. And so it's interesting because as I've grown older, I've come to realize that these are good qualities that I have.
Yeah.
But there have been so many times when I felt embarrassed about them.
Yes.
Like it was something
Yes.
I needed to hide.
And isn't that interesting that you feel, that you feel that sense of shame around it or whatever, because, like, again, I think my issue is men do it and they don't, it didn't, like, he didn't even think twice about it. It wasn't a big deal. You're talking about, women, women sort of saying to you, "Oh gosh, are you saying I should be selfish?" And one of the quotes that I use in the book is from the Jungian analyst Edward Edinger. He says, "In my experience, the basis of almost all psychological problems is an unsatisfactory relation to one's urge to individuality. And the healing process often involves an acceptance of what is commonly called selfish or power seeking. The majority of patients in psychotherapy need to learn how to be more effectively selfish and more effective in the use of their own personal power. They need to accept responsibility for the fact of being centers of power and effectiveness." I really like that, like effectively selfish, not selfish for selfishness sake, but in service to your growth, your unfolding, and, just like my friend sending the dish back at the restaurant, that didn't harm anyone, but it meant that he wasn't bearing something that he didn't need to carry.
Yeah. I like that emphasis on effectively selfish. And I remember that quote from the book and appreciating that part. And it ties into discernment, obviously.
Mhm.
One of the things that I've thought a lot about in relation to these qualities is I used to be very involved in nonviolent communication. And the founder of that, Marshall Rosenberg, said, "Never let them make you submit or rebel." And he talks about when we submit, we're reacting, but when we're rebelling, we're also reacting.
Yeah.
And so when we have choice, when we have awareness,
Mhm.
we have discernment, we don't have to submit or rebel. And that's true empowerment.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's great. I like that.
So, the title of your book refers to the vital spark, our feminine fire. And I did want to invite you to just talk a little bit about what you mean by that. How do you understand this inner spark? And what does it represent in the journey toward wholeness?
Mhm. Well, in some sense, I think that, in Jungian terminology, we might think about it as eros. And eros has this kind of particular meaning in the culture, because it's associated with, erotic, but that's not exactly how I mean it. Eros, of course, was the god of love. He was the son of Aphrodite. But when we think about Eros in a kind of Jungian sense, we're talking about that wonderful energy that connects us to other people, that connects us to life. It's that energy that makes everything feel a little juicy. It's the thing that makes you a little bit excited, or at least not entirely dreading when you wake up in the morning. You get out of bed and start your day. It's the thing that makes you look forward to something, or that makes you enjoy a good laugh, or, a good meal. So it's really, in some sense, the spirit of joy, of fulfillment, and I want to say too, of desire, the sense that we're seeking something, we're seeking creatures. That's a kind of fundamental trait of, certainly, of all mammals, and I would probably of all vertebrates, maybe beyond, that something invites us to leave the comfort and safety of the bed, say, and get up and go forth and get out into life and seek something, seek meaning, seek purpose, seek adventure, seek love, seek connection. And so that to me is what I think of when I think of the vital spark. It's a real sense of aliveness.
I love that. We are seeking creatures.
Hmm.
Yeah, I like thinking about it that way. And when we think back to what we were talking about earlier about that stuckness, it's like if you've gotten into a place in your life where you're not seeking and you're not kind of enlivening that aspect of curiosity and desire for growth, then it makes sense that you would wind up feeling that way.
Hmm. Yeah.
Well, I want to shift to talking about fairy tales now because they're so beautifully woven throughout your book, alongside clinical and personal stories that illustrate these ideas. And I wanted to first ask, why are fairy tales such powerful tools for psychological insight, especially for women?
We Jungians love fairy tales because they're archetypal material. So they're universal stories. Most fairy tales are thousands of years old. And, like myths, there are common motifs in fairy tales across cultures. So there's some way that they capture the universal aspects of human behavior and experiences. They're sort of like a storehouse of patterns, of psychological patterns, so we can find ourselves in them. And I think fairy tales are great for everyone, but, they do tend to be told in cultures by women. I mean, they really are. I don't want to say they're completely women's tales, because that's not true. There are some fairy tales that are contain profound wisdom that I think are very particular to men. But many, many tales are women's tales. And again, they were often told by women. So the people that collected them, like the Grimm's brothers, for example, often collected them from women. And it was often the women who sat around the fire in the evening and told and retold these stories. So they kind of contain the distilled wisdom of the ages, both men and women, but also in particular women's wisdom.
I used to really resist fairy tales because they felt sexist and patriarchal to me and kind of idealizing beauty and marriage in ways I couldn't relate to. But Jungian work, including yours, has helped me see them differently, as symbolic maps of the psyche.
Mhm.
And I now understand that, like dreams, every character can represent an aspect of the self. And that shift in perspective has opened up so much.
Yeah. Well, and that's an important perspective. So, for example, a kind of feminist sociological reading of Beauty and the Beast is it's a terrible tale that you should never tell your daughter, because you're encouraging women to get used to being in an abusive relationship, let's say. But if we see the beast as an aspect of the of beauty psyche, for example, then it's a part of ourselves that needs to be redeemed and related to. So it's a very different perspective to have to look at these tales psychologically.
Absolutely. And the symbolism of marriage is an interesting one. And I'd love for you to speak a little bit about that, not just as a romantic goal,
Hmm.
but, as a symbol of inner integration. And that features in a number of the stories you talk about in the
Hmm.
book.
Yeah, well, obviously, marriage often plays a big role in fairy tales, but I do see it as symbolic. So, the psyche uses these ancient categories of male and female to point out, to tell us something about the inner unknown, usually that which is most foreign from ego, that we're least aware of, will be clothed in the guise of an opposite sex person, for example, in a dream. And so we can apply that same thinking to a fairy tale where the prince that arises is not an actual prince or a man who kind of rescues us from outside, but it's something princely in us that comes on the scene at the right moment and helps the conscious personality to deal with something that brings new skills, new fortitude, new attitudes. And as you're saying, it shows a kind of integration between what's been, especially marriage, between what's been conscious and what has heretofore been unconscious or that we've been unaware of.
Mm. It makes marriage as a symbol so much more interesting. I love how you highlight in a number of these stories these moments when a woman's refusal to be pleasing becomes a turning point in the story.
Hmm.
Like in The Frog King, when the princess flings the frog against the wall in disgust. And it's that act of defiance and authenticity that's actually what breaks the spell. Or in The Pink Pearl Prince, where the daughter claims her desire even though it angers her father.
Hmm.
What do these moments of defiance or refusal reveal about the feminine psyche?
Yeah, I mean, The Frog Prince is such an extraordinary story, right? And she's, maybe I'll just tell the tale very, very quickly for those who may not have it at hand. So there's a princess. She's a kind of perfect little princess. She lives in a lovely castle, and her favorite toy is a golden ball. And she likes to sit at the edge of a well and toss the ball up and down, which is a very, very, very bad idea, because if you sit at the edge of a body of water tossing a ball, inevitably you will at some point drop the ball in the body of water. And that is indeed what happens. So the ball sinks to the bottom of the well, and she sits down and cries and cries. And finally, a little frog comes up and says, "Oh, Princess, why are you crying?" And she says, "Oh, I lost my favorite golden ball." And he says, "Well, don't worry, don't cry. If I go down and get it, will you do something for me?" And she says, "Oh, yes, yes." He says, "Well, I'll go down and get your ball, but I want to be able to come home with you and eat off your golden plate and sleep in your silken bed." And she says, "Well, yes, 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 whatever you want." So the frog dives down to the bottom of the well, and he brings the ball back, and he gives it to her, and she's delighted, and she runs off and back home. And the frog says, "Princess, princess, wait for me." But she's forgotten all about him. So she's there at dinner that night, eating dinner with her father, the king, and we hear squish, 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 and then a knock at the door, and the frog says, "Princess, princess, let me in." And she looks horrified. She looks ashen, and her father says, "Well, what's wrong?" And so she tells him, and her father says, "You have to keep your word. You have to. If you said you'd do something, you have to do it." So she reluctantly gets up and she brings the frog in, and she's kind of holding him, by two fingers, and she places him on the table. And he's like, "Push your plate closer to me." So he eats off her plate for a little while, and she's just disgusted. And then he says, "I'm tired. Let's go to bed." So she takes him to bed, and he insists on sleeping on her beautiful silken pillow. And she is so disgusted at the thought of this wet, slimy thing on her pillow that she takes him and she flings him against the wall. And the moment he hits the wall, he turns into a handsome prince. And you can sort of guess what happens after that. But I actually think it's just such a brilliant image, because in some sense, this beautiful princess, talk about kind of an innocence complex. She's sort of had a very perfect protected life, and she does have a good father. Her father, the king, he's a good king, he's a good father. He tells her this important thing that you've got to do. You've got to follow through on what you promise. That's not a bad lesson to learn, that you need to keep your word. But at the same time, at no point has she ever really been challenged to be authentic, to take a stand and sort of say what she wants. So there are these real dilemmas in life where we may need to choose between doing the thing that we should do versus really taking a stand and being true to ourselves. And these are not easy situations where the answer is always straightforward. These are a dilemma is a dilemma because there is no answer. It is an insoluble dilemma. And I think many of us can relate to being in such a dilemma. Do I do what I said I would do, or do I kind of stand up for myself? And I think the princess is sort of in this fairy tale. And she at first kind of obeys her father and does what she said she would do, but that only heightens the conflict, as it were. And when it really comes down to it, when it comes to just sort of going along and welcoming the frog into her bed, she takes a stand, and that's the thing that brings about this transformation. So it's something about, again, kind of choicefully choosing ourselves in the interest of growth. So the Pink Pearl Prince, which starts off a lot like Beauty and the Beast, actually. The thing is that the princess asks for something that's so outrageous. She doesn't even know why she asks for it, really. But she asks for something that is beyond the ordinary gift. She's not asking for something out of vanity. She's not asking for something out of greed. She is honoring a kind of psycho-spiritual thirst. And so I think that both of these moments that you've referenced really, really speak to this truth that at times we need to do something in the interest of wholeness, in the interest of growth, that might make other people unhappy or inconvenience other people.
You talk about how these tales reflect in subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways how women betray themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So those were just examples of women actually being true to themselves. But there are often these examples of women betraying themselves in the name of being good or the name of being agreeable, even when it costs them deeply.
Mm-hmm.
Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, probably the most striking example of that in the fairy tale is sort of the first one that I tell in the book, which it really kind of lays out the conflict, which is just an extraordinary tale called Fitcher's Bird. Again, most people are probably more familiar with the French version, which is Bluebeard. I think Fitcher's Bird, which is the Grimm's version, is a tale actually with much more depth to it. But in the tale, a sorcerer comes to the house dressed as a beggar, and he asks the first daughter for some, some alms or some bread or something. She gives him some bread, and the moment that she gives him the bread, it's like she's given away her power. So she's been moved by pity, by concern, and what that has done is given him power over her. He's able to cause her to get in his basket, and then he takes her home, and it doesn't end well for her. Let's just put it that way. Then he comes back and he does the same thing to the second sister and then the third sister. But the third sister begins to realize that she can't just blindly follow whatever he tells her to do. So there is this image in this, kind of up to that point in the story of exactly what you're saying, of this kind of self-betrayal. I'm going to maybe ignore my intuition that this isn't a safe situation. I'm going to just do what I'm told to do. I'm going to be nice, I'm going to be kind, I'm going to be agreeable, even though this is a manifestly dangerous situation. And the first two sisters, as you might know, wind up chopped up into bits. It's a very violent image. And it's only the third sister who can figure out how to break the rules. She has to figure out which rule to break. And she breaks the right rules, and she's cunning. Then she's able to save herself and also rescue her sister.
This is such a great example of why fairy tales are so much more interesting than some might think, or certainly more interesting than I once thought. Because you include a number of stories like this that involve young women getting tricked or unwittingly giving something precious away, which has a lot of symbolism in and of itself. But then you show how it's the ones who are smart and able to be a little bit tricky themselves who are able to save the situation. And they often do so by doing things that are really subversive and even violent. And you show how there's a lot of rich symbolism and meaning in that for us. Another interesting thing you talk about is the way the number 3 shows up so often in fairy tales. You note that it's a symbol of wholeness, and that these sequences of 3 often reflect stages of development. And you already touched on the 3 sisters in the Fitcher's Bird story, but could you say more about this pattern of threes and how it relates to psychological growth?
So the number that represents wholeness for Jung is 4. But what we often see in fairy tales is that there's a sequence of 3, and then there's a culmination, so there's kind of a fourth thing. And the interesting thing about 3 is it gets this sense of, like, movement toward wholeness. In fairy tales where there's, the first daughter, the second daughter, and the third daughter or something like that, I often think it's helpful to see that as a developmental sequence. So my favorite example of this actually is, the Three Billy Goats Gruff, which I think many, many, many of us remember that tale from childhood about the three goats that went across the bridge, and the first one, goes across the bridge, and a big troll comes up and says, "I'm going to eat you," and the little billy goat says, "Oh, I'm just a little billy goat. My bigger brother's coming." And so then the second one comes, the same thing happens, and then the third one comes, and the big billy goat, throws the troll off the bridge, and everyone lives happily ever after. And it's interesting that kids love that story. My son loved that story, and I had to read it and read it and read it and read it to him, and we would act it out again and again and again. And probably at the 100th time reading it, I was really, like, internalizing it, and I was like, "Oh, well, it's such a great story for little kids because it is that process of kind of, developing an ego that can meet challenges, and the way that in the beginning we don't have a strong enough ego to meet a challenge, but maybe eventually we can be the big billy goat that, throws the troll off the bridge." So that is a very I think that's a very young story. In Fitcher's Bird, it's sort of the same thing. I mean, we're always learning and growing, but I think about that story that I think they tell in AA about, the first time you walk down the street, there's a hole in the middle of the street and you fall into it. And maybe you do that 10 times. And then you realize that you can walk around the hole. And eventually you realize you can take a different route. That's a little bit like what happens with these daughters. In other words, every sister is kind of an iteration of the same psyche at a different point in time. So the first time we go into a situation, we don't know what we're doing and we don't handle it very well. Maybe the next time we make the exact same mistakes, but eventually the 10th time, the 20th time, the 30th time, then we're like the third daughter. We're like, okay, I think I have a thought or two about what I might do differently this time.
I love the way that validates and supports the path of growth and becoming conscious. That we're going to keep making the same mistakes, but that over time we learn and eventually we can break the spell, so to speak, break the pattern. So the epilogue to your book is called Coming Home to Yourself, which is such a rich and beautiful phrase. Could you share what it means to you to come home to oneself?
Yeah, I just saw a really beautiful quote this morning from Marion Woodman. Like, if you travel long enough and far enough, you'll meet yourself on the road, and you'll say yes. I think it's something about kind of falling in love with yourself. I want to say almost just really kind of appreciating who you are with your strengths and your weaknesses and your foibles, but really just coming to appreciate that person, who you are, where you've been.
And that is perfectly captured by Derek Walcott's poem, Love After Love, which you include at the end. It's one of my favorites. He says, and I'm paraphrasing, the time will come when you will love again the stranger who was yourself, the one who has loved you all your life and knows you by heart.
Hmm.
Well, Lisa, thank you again for this conversation and for this wonderful book. It feels especially essential for those of us in midlife looking to reconnect with what we've lost and reclaim the fullness of who we are. So thank you.
Thanks for having me on.
This has been The Deepening with Suzanne Lever. If you enjoy conversations that lead you deeper into self and soul, I invite you to subscribe, follow, and tune in for future episodes. Thanks for joining us.